And to get started, I wanted to hear from your references and your inspirations. What in this world brought you to the universe of visual effects?
Well, I think most of the visual effects people of my generation, we were inspired by the movies and TV shows we saw as children. And in my case, it would have been Forbidden Planet, the first great cerebral science fiction epic. And I remember as a boy seeing that, I could tell that there were miniatures, the spaceship, animation, paintings, and then live actors. And it was like an epiphany for me, because I could tell that you could combine all these art forms to create a new cinematic reality that could live on the screen in a very convincing way. And then, of course, there was the work of the great Ray Harryhausen. My mother took me to see The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad when I was 12 at Radio City Music Hall in New York. And they had a little display in the lobby showing how Ray had miniatures and rear projections. So I immediately went home and I had a broken 8mm projector and cut a hole in the bottom of a cardboard box, taped some tracing paper to it, shot some 8mm movies of my brother running around like this, and then had toy dinosaurs chasing him around. And I was so pleased. Many years later, I got to have dinner with Ray at ASC, the American Society of Cinematographers, and told them, "It's your fault I'm here, Ray."
Yeah, I have all those movies in Blu-ray, and they're still enchanting, although in a very quirky way, right? Because it's more surreal than real, the effects, but it's fascinating.
Well, I think in the future people are going to look back on our way the same way. I look back on my work on Star Trek, especially the early seasons before CG, and I kind of grit my teeth, and it looks as quaint as George Méliès's Voyage to the Moon compared to today's standards.
All right, and you were telling about your experiences as a young boy playing with special effects, but your first model as a professional, when did that came to be?
Oh, as a professional, well, my first model, I remember I was 8 years old and my mother took me to see 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And my mother, we got to the theater late, we walked in and the movie had already started, and the first image I saw was a profile of the Nautilus underwater. And it so amazed me and so impressed me that I went home and I made a model of the Nautilus out of cardboard. I still have it. My mother saved it all these years. If you like, I'll send it to you.
Oh, great. That would be amazing to see a picture of this. 8 years old.
Yeah. And I never made a model before, but I could tell they were planes and they were cut a certain way. So I just cut them out of scissors and eyeballed it, and it came together. And when I'll send it to you, when you see it, you'll see, for an 8-year-old, it's not bad. And then years later, a friend of mine gave me an accurate model of that Nautilus, and it's still, for an 8-year-old, it was pretty good.
And how did you come to be in the industry? When was your start?
Well, I made student films in college, and then after serving in the Peace Corps, building small dams and bridges out in the jungles of Thailand, I took a job working for the Ministry of Education on a children's show and called My Tree and the Magic Chopsticks. And I built an animation stand that did all the animated characters with paper cutouts because we had no money. And professionally, after my wife and I came back to the United States, I taught college for a couple of years on Cape Cod. Then I went back to grad school in California, and while I was in grad school, I had an exhibition of paintings. I was painting, and Marcia Lucas, who was George Lucas's wife at the time, had come to the school to give a seminar on film editing. She had just cut Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro. And by a fluke, I had a one-man showing in a small gallery on campus, and she went and looked at my paintings and came and found me and said, would you be interested in doing matte paintings? I had no idea what they were. So she introduced me to the great Dennis Murin at ILM, and Dennis was a very kind mentor, and he introduced me to Alan Maley and Michael Pangrazio, two of the great matte artists. And I was teaching 2 courses at the time and had to finish school, and they recommended me to Universal, and I started with the original Battlestar Galactica and Buck Rogers in the 24th century, and that began my career in visual effects.
Great. And as I understand it, your first experience with Star Trek was Star Trek 4. How did that came to be, and how it was?
One of the executives at Paramount knew my work. I was doing a lot of title design work at the time, and they wanted me to design the title sequence for it. And so that was my first official relationship with Star Trek. And then I worked a little bit on Star Trek V. I consulted with Bill Shatner on green screen or a big blue screen shot for an outer space commercial. And it was like a real estate commercial. And this guy comes down on blue screen and says, "Hi, I'm David Picozzi, and I'll tell you about buying land on this planet." And he was holding up a fish. So I went to the market and bought a fish, and then I bought a green transparent bathtub mat and cut it in weird shapes so it made alien-looking fins on the fish, and that's what he holds up in the movie. And then when Next Generation was starting, Peter Lorison, who was in charge of television post at Paramount at the time, called me up and said, "Hey, we'd like you to come by and meet Gene Roddenberry and talk about doing some storyboards for the series." And so, of course, I said yes. And Gene had this idea that we would be able to do 40 stock shots, and they would serve the series, and that worked for about 2 weeks. And then Rob Legato and I alternated episodes as visual effects supervisor, and I stayed with Star Trek for 18 years, doing Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, both, and I designed the titles for Voyager and Deep Space Nine, as well as visual effects supervision, and did a lot of martial arts work and directed second unit and episodic direction.
And I think you were a fan of Star Trek when you entered the franchise, but actually, you tried to hide that, right?
Well, actually, not too much, because when the original series was on, I was in college, and in those days, no college student had a TV, so I never really saw it. I would see an occasional episode now and again, and the first Star Trek I saw was Star Trek: The Motion Picture, with Douglas Trumbull's brilliant visual effects for that movie, and that's. But I didn't start doing visual effects for Star Trek till Next Generation.
I see. So you were not emotionally attached to Star Trek when you
no, but I liked all science fiction, so I had obviously a fan of the genre, and what's not to like about Star Trek. But I wasn't like a fanboy, with that it became my religion.
I see. And of course, back in those days, you were making up new techniques on ways to do special effects. And I was wondering how important was your original education and background in arts in order to be as successful as you were with 18 years working with Star Trek?
Well, I think background in fine arts was really critical, because it developed a sense of composition, and also I have a background in theater. I have my undergraduate degree was fine arts with a theater minor, and in grad school it was film and theater, master's program. And I think theater also reinforced the need for serving the story. So I made sure that whenever we did a visual effect, it wasn't to aggrandize ourselves, it was always to serve the story, and for whether our shot was on for a few seconds or a longer time, it had to move the story along for that period of time. So by the end, the audience knew a little bit more about the story, but was also delighted. And I find a lot of young people that are coming into the industry that don't have a fine arts background have a tougher time with the artistic issues, even though they know the software better than I will ever know it.
I see. Well, one of the things that makes your work remarkable, and several of the people who worked with you say about this, is the creative solutions you gave back then, and you know, in developing new effects and new ideas, such as using shampoo bottles as in Arsenal of Freedom of the first season of TNG. So I was wondering, what are your proudest creations that have to do with this kind of creativity?
Oh, I think the first Borg show, Q Who, I was very proud of. I was proud of the finale of Next Generation, All Good Things. I was proud of having the opportunity to work with so many wonderful people. I think one of the most iconic creations I did for Star Trek was the Bat Left. And I actually have Bat Left #1 right here. Do you want to take a look at it?
Oh, sure. I'd love to.
It's right outside. I'll be right back.
Okay. Wow. So that is the first one.
Well, the first one was a foam core one I made to show Rick Berman. And then after that, this was the first metal one ever made.
I see. But when they were battling, they wouldn't use one of metal as this one.
No, we made two types. We made the metal ones, which were for show and carrying, and then we made rubber ones with this very thin steel core, and so the actors could fight with them without much risk of hurting each other. And then the sound department, that always did a wonderful job, would put in metal clangs and sounds and stuff. So, and so that one, and how that came about is I studied martial arts in Asia for a number of years, and then I continued studying when I came back to the U.S. and was fortunate to have had some really wonderful masters and who taught me so much. And so I've been imagining the Batleth for a long time, but I had no reason to make it. We had an episode where Worf was to inherit a bladed Klingon weapon, and the guys in the art department are wonderful artists. They're all still friends, but they sent down something that looked like a pirate's cutlass, like, you know, curved blade. And I said, we need to do something original for the Klingons. So I made a foam core Batleth and went to Rick Berman, the executive producer, and said, look, I can make this weapon. I'll invent a whole new martial arts style for it. And Rick, in his inimitable way, said, well, if it was 2 inches shorter, I'd accept it. And,
so he was just joking around, because it's brilliant. It's brilliant.
And it's ergonomically correct. I always, even as a boy, I could tell phony movie weapons that were designed to look cool but had no real value. And I was pleased when the Korean Martial Arts Association declared that the first new bladed weapon in 200 years that had practical value and they approved of.
I see. Well, since we're talking about battles and the martial arts of the Klingons, I was wondering if you've seen what they've done with it in Star Trek Discovery, and what do you think of the new battles? Are you pleased with it? You don't like it? What have you to say about it?
To me, looking at the new Batleth was reinventing the wheel for its own sake, and to me it was designed by somebody who's not familiar with combat. And it looks like a fossilized, segmented worm with 2 blades sticking in the wrong direction. So to say I am impressed would be an overstatement.
Okay, so you're not too pleased about it. All right.
Well, hey, it's their show. They can do whatever they want. But as far as a Batleth, it's underwhelming.
All right. Well, let's talk about visual effects and the transition from models to CGI. So this happened practically in Voyager, and then Enterprise it was over and it was all CG. So how was it to start a show with a physical hero ship and then turn to CG over the years, as in Voyager?
Well, it was a gradual evolution. When CG started to come in, there were great pioneers, specific data images, did commercials with it. Then there were Babylon 5 and Sequest, which were the first all CG shows. And we felt that they weren't as realistic as models, but they could be done certainly faster. So we eased into it, and we experimented a little bit with CG on Next Generation, where the Galaxy's child baby was CG, and because I wanted it to be like Bambi and cute in a moving way, and the mother was a physical model. But my idea was that as they grow, they become very stiff and calcified that's how they move around, by projecting energy in space. And then we had the thing that looked, the crystalline creature that would come and looked like tumbleweed that would roll around. And as we got to Deep Space Nine, we had the wormhole, and then Odo had to be CG because of his morphing from one state to another. And we still were not real happy with the spaceships, but the scripts became bigger and bigger, and it would take, say, a whole day to shoot a simple flyby with a spaceship and model. And if it was an elaborate move, sometimes it could take 2 or 3 days, so we just physically didn't have the time. So we would do hybrid shows like the Voyager title sequence, or on Deep Space Nine, Sacrifice of Angels, where the foreground ships were physical models that we could get a good look at, but the background ships would be CG because they were far away and you didn't really get a good look at them because your eye would go to what's in the foreground. So that's how we would be able to get large fleets. But as rendering times improved, computing power improved, and the software improved, we gradually shifted over to CG, and Enterprise with Scott Bakula was the first all CG Star Trek.
Yeah, and about the Voyager model, I have a friend who is obsessed about the little windows in the physical model, because you did some transparencies on some pictures of the sets inside.
Yeah, the Voyager model was built by the great model maker Tony Meininger, and I asked, there were 2 challenges with that, which in CG is simple, but the first challenge was that the wings had to fold up when Voyager went to warp, and so Tony had to put these very powerful but tiny motion control electric motors inside with special high-tech aerospace chains that would control it so that it could repeat itself perfectly over and over again for the different passes that we need. For example, whenever you saw the Voyager or Enterprise, you'd see it. We had to do 7 passes to get all the elements, because the windows and warp drive and the beauty pass and the matte pass would each require a different exposure. And I always was a little bit unsatisfied with the Enterprise in TNG because the windows were white, and at a distance that was great, but when it was close they looked like frosted windows. So I went around to the sets on Star Trek, the full-size sets, and took slides of them and gave the slides to Tony, who made little cycloramas inside some of the windows, so that as the ship went by, you'd actually get parallax and get a sense that there's an actual chamber or compartment through that window.
And those pictures, did they follow the patterns you laid out for the ship, or it was any set?
They were pretty random, because you wouldn't get that good a look at them because we never get that close to it, but you could tell that there was a room through the window.
And do you happen to have those pictures?
No, unfortunately I don't, because there were slides and I gave them all to Tony, so they're lost in the dim history of television.
All right. Well, talking about the transition we can see that some early CGI is not as good as model work. Nowadays, perhaps it's as good as, but not in those first days. What were the criteria you used when choosing between CGI or model work in those transition?
It was how close the ship would be to camera, and we have a fancy word in English called verisimilitude, and it means how close to reality something is, and when we wanted it to be real. But the same kind of artistic rules apply, that if you, say, front light a model and it's lit kind of flat, it looks like plastic on a stick. Where if you backlight the model and do very high chiaroscuro, light and shadow, and you leave a lot of the image dark so that the audience can project their own imagination into it, because the audience can always imagine more than we can really show them. So you want to guide them to believe what they're seeing. And the same is true with CG. It's all about lighting. If you light it dramatically and beautifully, then it will be more acceptable to the sense of reality an audience expects.
And what about models nowadays in the entertainment industry? Do you think they still have a role to play, or is it something that is all but extinct at this point?
No, they still have a role to play for certain situations. For example, blowing things up. If you say you're going to blow up a building or blow up a spaceship, a physical explosion to me looks better. If you look at Independence Day, for which Volker Engler and his company won the Academy Award, there's incredible shots of the skyscrapers in New York blowing up story by story. Those are created by the great pyro technician Joe Viscoso. And yeah, you could have done that CG, and probably today with the best CG particle animation you could equal it, but at the time it was made, there's no comparison to do a physical explosion. But for example, one of the things that CG has made possible that we were never able to do with physical models was water, because you could never get the scale of the waves to match the scale of the model. So even the best miniature ships floating on water always looked like miniature ships floating on water. And the great computer geniuses that created water simulation have made possible things like Day After Tomorrow, those incredible tsunamis that come in, and that's something that would never have been achievable with physical models.
All right. So you, just to reiterate, you think there's still work for models, especially in explosions and something like that.
Yeah, and other things too, and a lot of it is artistic choices. Like I would still use models, say, for a foreground cutting piece. Say if we're in a cave, and you want to get a sense that the cave is a partial set. Well, if you make a model stalagmite in the foreground or a stalactite to pan by, then suddenly it puts an extra layer of reality, and that's a model. So they're still used, and they're still great model makers. Like in Titanic, Tony Meininger made the engine room of the Titanic as a physical model when it could have been CG.
I see. Well, let's talk a little bit about the latest installments in the Star Trek franchise that you were not directly involved with. So the Kelvin movies of J.J. Abrams and Discovery. We already talked about the Bat'leth, but what about the general view? How do you see this reimagining of the visual of Star Trek? Do you like it? How do you see it?
Well, actually, to be truthful, I'm distant from it. It's their own reinvention, and it's their own thing, and I'm not directly involved, so I don't really comment on it. I felt that there was some hubris in how some people were treated from that offered to help them from earlier Star Treks, and I felt that was not as courteous and respectful as it might have been, especially to a couple of people I have immense respect for. And so I'm not a part of it, and it's not part of my life, and I don't comment on it much more than that. With the Klingons, I wish they had just called them something else rather than change their appearance so radically. And the great makeup artist Michael Westmore did such a brilliant job with Klingons on our shows that I felt they should just call them another species and let it be at that.
All right. I can feel you're treading, a fine line there not to be discourteous, and that's okay. Well, let's talk then about the remastering of the earlier shows, because you've been involved with that with the Next Generation.
I did season 2 only, which I was glad to do because it was one of my favorite seasons, and got to. One of the problems with television is that the air dates are not flexible. So a lot of times you just wish you had another day to work on a shot, and you don't, and you just have to live with it the way it is. So it gave me the opportunity to go back into shots that I was never really satisfied with and rework them and make them a little better. And especially with Q-Who, my friend and one of the greatest matte artists in the history of cinema, Sid Dutton, did that amazing matte shot of the interior of the Borg cube, where we see our crew on an alcove and we pull back and we see this giant space. And Sid did that as an oil painting. And the painting was quite big. It was maybe 6 feet by 5 feet, possibly bigger, maybe 8 by 10. And Sid's partner, the brilliant cinematographer Bill Taylor, the painting was on masonite, and Bill cut out a little hole in the physical painting and put some rear projection material in it. And so when you see the people on it, they're actually projected from a roll of film in the back as the camera pulls back on its motion control track. And then every once in a while, Bill stopped the camera moving and then would build a little system of little toys and little pipes in front of it, so that as you see the shot in the final form, it looks like we're going through this maze of structures. And when we were doing the revised version of it, Sid knew what would hold up on standard definition TV, but when we did it in high def, you could tell it was a painting. So I enlisted another great digital artist, a man named Sean Jackson, who had the greatest reverence for Sid and Sid's work. So Sean rebuilt the interior of the Borg cube, and now that we had technology, we could make the water move. We could put more little moving electric patterns and stuff in it that was technically impossible when we did the original version. And so it lives up to the spirit of Sid's brilliant painting, but it now has that greater feeling of verisimilitude in the high def format. So I had a great time doing that and fixing a couple of things. But there was something interesting when we shot the motion control miniatures. We went to a company called CIS, Composite Image Systems, in Hollywood, and CIS had a transfer system from film to video, where they took the gears, the movements from an optical printer, and built it into the transfer systems that normally had rubber wheels. So each frame was precisely placed, so all the lights and the mats and the running lights and the silhouettes all were in perfect register. They all matched each other perfectly. Interestingly enough, when we retransferred from the original film negative using the current state-of-the-art technology, it wasn't as steady. So all the compositors had to go back through by hand and make sure each frame perfectly matched the other frame, and it took a long time because the pin registered transfer systems were now gone, the way of buffalo hunting.
I see. So the older technology was ready to deal with the materials you filmed back then, and the newer technology had a hard time dealing with them.
Right. So it required a lot of finessing by our compositors, which we all thought was amusing.
And there was a mandate to be very truthful to the original work in this remastering, right? There's a bit of tweaking, but the idea is to preserve the original work.
Right, and we would improve it when it made sense. For example, planet surfaces were better, and we could do those better. And sometimes we would swap out what had been a physical model to a CG ship for artistic or technical reasons, and also there were studio executives assigned to it, and then Mike and Denise Okuda were also involved, making sure their job was to making sure everything was true to the original intent. So it was fun. I noticed some of the ones we were very careful on season 2 to recreate the transporters exactly how they were done for us on Next Generation, but I noticed some of the others, whoever did them, the transporters looked kind of more flat like in the original series. They didn't have the three-dimensional volumetric feel that our transporters did, because what we did is, on my shows, I would actually airbrush the characters so they looked like a three-dimensional white statue, so that the sparkles would be denser in some areas than others, and it gave it that greater sense of something happening in 3D space rather than a two-dimensional window.
I see. And of course, you were involved with season 2, but there are some much work from you in later seasons, and one that stands out is the matte painting of Borth from Rightful Heir of the 6th season, which is it's a Klingon setting. It was your matte painting, right?
What was it again? The
Borth, the monastery, the Klingon monastery.
Oh, yeah, the monastery. Yeah, I forgot the name of it.
Yeah, okay.
1,000 shots. Yeah, that was my painting, and it was based on my experiences in Nepal, looking at Tibetan architecture. I did a long trek in Nepal when I was a young man, and it was also based on the Rocky Mountains that I visited in Western Canada. So I had this idea of these spectacular snow-covered mountains with something that had the feel of a Tibetan monastery.
Yeah, that's really great. I love that painting. I think it's amazing. And well, but talking about remastering again, back then you decided to make post-production directly in video, and then that was what generated the need to do a remastering now for high definition. And we only had that for the Next Generation, but not for Deep Space Nine and Voyager. Do you feel there's a chance Deep Space Nine and Voyager will get a remastering treatment as TNG got?
I don't know. Yeah, because Enterprise was the first show we did in high def. That's up to the studio. I would think so, but maybe not. It depends on if they feel it's worth the investment, and if the fans are eager to get them, then if they see some profit in it, they may do it. But I think, especially both Deep Space Nine and Voyager, we were hitting our stride in terms of cranking out good quality work. With the first few seasons of Next Generation, it was very experimental because nobody had really done a lot of that stuff before, especially for television. And so I think they hold up pretty well. They're works of art. It's like there's a lot of people, a lot of fans have written to me, it's like, why repaint the Sistine Chapel ceiling with an airbrush? Michael Angelo did a good job with a paintbrush.
Yeah, of course. But do you have any regrets that this was made, finished in video, and then you don't have the high definition? Or changing the question a little bit, how satisfying it was for you who worked on the original shows to see, for instance, season 2 being remade in high definition?
I was pleased with season 2. I think we had a lot of really dedicated artists that worked with me on it. We worked at Illuminate Hollywood, and they assembled a team specifically to do that. And they, every member of the visual effects team, and we had Doug Drexler back from Star Trek, who's a wonderful artist, and Michael Davidson and a number of other people, that their artistic integrity was such that they felt they were restoring masterworks of art, so they didn't feel a need to reinvent the wheel. They just wanted to take it, and they were wonderful to work with because I could guide them. And a lot of the younger guys whose background was solely in the computer were amazed at how we actually did things in the old days. Like, oh, you made a solar flare by dumping salt on a bowling ball? They couldn't believe it.
What kinds of innovations and creativity you had to do those days that pops out today, such as this example? Like you mentioned Arsenal of Freedom before. Originally they hired a sculptor to make the drone robot that was flying through the jungle, and they were going to fly it on wires, and it weighed about 80 pounds, and it was unwieldy, and it looked like a claw like this with 3 prongs, so it kept getting snagged in the branches, and we realized we couldn't use it. So the producers came to me and say, do something, we have no money. So I took a plastic Easter egg, a shampoo bottle, cut an arc on it, and a legs pantyhose container, glued them together, and airbrushed it so it looked like it was metallic. And then I put blue tape on the where I wanted light to come, and then shot it from a green screen. And everybody thought I was crazy because I decided not to do it with motion control. And so I turned it upside down because the model was too fragile to use right side up. And I had a monitor with an upside down image so I could see the shots where it would appear. And I did the whole thing by hand with it on a pole. And because at that time I'd only done Tai Chi for about 20 years, so I was used to moving very slowly and very smoothly. I still do Tai Chi every day to this day. And so all the motions, and I felt it would give it a more natural bobble than the slick perfection of motion control. And so so I did all the model shots for that episode in one day. Wow. At the State TNG. Yeah.
And everybody thought I was crazy until they saw it.
Yeah, and it's amazing because the actual thing would have to deal with an atmosphere, and so you have winds. It shouldn't be too perfect as motion control, as you said.
Yeah, and there was another aspect to that episode, is that Geordi, there's an invisible larger drone in orbit around the planet that's attacking the Enterprise, and no one can see it. And Geordi figures out that if he lures it into the atmosphere, there would be the heat, the friction from heat that would create flare in the atmosphere. So what I did is I made a second model, covered it with black flocking, it's like velvet, and then glued slivers of plastic bag on the model. Then I put that on a motion control rig and shot it, figuring in space it would move more smoothly, and then put electric fans around it so that the plastic slivers would flap in the wind, and I kept the shutter open for 3 seconds a frame so it would blur, so it actually looked like hot gases. Then I shot newspapers burning in an old barbecue, turned the camera sideways, and keyed the newspapers through the flapping plastic, and that's what looked like the re-entry heat as the hot gases formed around the invisible ship.
Amazing. Amazing. Fantastic. Well, what are you up to now then? What are your current projects? What are you doing?
In January I finished a Marvel superhero show called The Gifted, and I've been avoiding taking on new projects because I'm working on a book commissioned by CBS, and so I want to finish the book without distraction. So I've been focusing on that, doing fine arts. I wrote a play in graduate school that won some awards, and I want to rewrite that play and update it a little bit and look into producing that. It was a science fiction play set in in an alien prison, and it had several characters, insectoids, reptilians, and a three-legged creature, and they all wound up being reincarnated in Star Trek Enterprise.
Yeah, that was what I was about to mention. It remembers the Zindi.
And one of the things that I wanted to do with that play, and I think why it won some awards, was I wanted to change the relationship between the audience and the play. That in most theaters there's a stage, and the play's over there and the audience sits over here. But in my play, I did it in a black box theater that had no stage. And so I designed a series of geometric ramps that moved around. And then there were negative spaces that were maybe shoulder height below the floor. And so every audience member that came in was given a little floral poncho. And so they put it over their head. And so when they sat in those pits, they played, they became part of the set, and they played beds of sentient hydroponic plants. And so that had a collective mentality the way an audience does. So it gave the actors an excuse to talk to them. And I even put a dummy in there. So later in the play, one of the evil characters reaches down and he grabs the head of one of the dummies and lifts it up, and then had somebody blow with a bellows red glitter, and for that instant the audience was shocked that, oh, somebody pulled their head off. And so it changed. So the audience was both, they were the audience, they were part of the set, and they were a collective character.
Wow, great. It should be amazing to be there and be part of this audience in midst of the action.
Yeah, and it was so popular that the student body had a petition to extend the run of the play by 2 months so everybody could see it, which was unheard of. And I'm also working with my partner, Brandon McDougall, who is one of the digital model builders and animators on Star Trek. And Brandon became a luthier and a violin maker. And so I had this idea about guitar ergonomics. And so I sent a sketch to Brandon and said, well, what do you think about this idea? And he said, well, let's make some. So now that I'm kind of taking some time off from working, I want to promote those guitars. We have a few prototypes. If you like, I'll send you some pictures of them.
Oh, I'd love to have that. And tell us a little bit more about the book. It's a Star Trek book, right?
It's a Star Trek book, and embarrassingly, the book is called Star Trek: The Artistry of Dan Curry, and I'm working with a co-writer, a wonderful man in London, Ben Robinson, and Ben and I are working on it together, and it's anecdotes about how we did things. Then there's some funny stories about things that happened on set, and then there are a lot of commentary by cast members and people I work with, like Ron Moore, my colleague in visual effects, Kate Mulgrew, Scott Bakula, Armin Shimmerman, Michael Dorn, all have little monographs that they wrote, what it was like to work with me and how horrible that was.
Great. Let me ask you about your cameos. You did a bit of cameo work in Star Trek, right? How did that come to be?
Yeah, I was usually a dead guy, a dead bad guy. And then Mike Okuda would always approach me and say, hey, we need a dead bad guy. And so I'd always do my best sneer and look evil, and then Mike would take the picture and fit it into whatever they were doing.
Okay. And the book, does it have a street date yet?
Yeah, it's supposed to be released September 2020.
Whoa.
So we have time to finesse. I'm glad, because we have time to finesse the book and get it as good as possible.
Great. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure many fans will be as well. Well,
it will be available on Amazon.
Yeah, great. We'll look for it for sure. Let me ask you one last thing. Would you like for a chance to be in a Star Trek convention here in Brazil if it happens to have the chance?
Oh, I'd love to. I only know a couple of people from Brazil, and the first encounter I had with a Brazilian was when I was in high school. We had an exchange student. I can still remember his name, Marcos Santos, and we had a soccer team. You guys call it football, and I was on the soccer team, and we were terrible. and this kid comes from Brazil, and he comes out, and we'd heard that Brazil was really good at soccer, and he comes out and he starts warming up, and he's kicking the ball around, and we all look at him and go, that was when I realized we do absolutely nothing about soccer. And so Marcus became the ad hoc coach because he knew more about soccer than probably anybody in the city. And also being a really nice person.
All right. Dan, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm really thankful for this interview, and I hope to send you the link when we get it published.
Okay. I hope I didn't blather on too much.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, and I'll send you, as soon as we hang up, I'll send you a couple of pictures.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so look for your email in a few minutes.
All right.
Hey, nice to meet you. You look a lot like my friend and the first compositor, Fred Raimondi, who's one of a genius in digital compositing.
Okay, I'm not a genius, but you have to do with that.
And Fred is also one of the best guitar players in LA.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much, Dan. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.